So it's important here, before we move on, to note that Surah Abasa, in conjunction with several other surahs, like for instance when the Quran says وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ, that how do you know, or what is it that it opens the door for salvation? It is to free a slave, or to feed an orphan, or to help an orphan, or to feed a poor person. That the Quran reaffirms what we already encountered in Surah al-Zumar, that the issue is not just to do good, but the issue is to do what is beautifully good. So while from a technical perspective you could say you could say that you could tell someone don't interrupt, but that is not what beauty calls for. Beauty calls for beyond what is technical and what is simply socially acceptable. And this is a critical point, because I think in contemporary Islam, Muslims often forget this. It is not enough that they do what is in the law books, halal or haram, but they are called upon to do what is beyond that, what you would say, so if you want the fancy name for it, virtue ethics. But if you don't want to be, if you just want to use common language, is to do what a beautiful human being would do. Now, this is particularly important for those who position themselves as teachers or leaders or imams or in any position of guidance and leadership in the Muslim Ummah. Ideally, when the Prophet ﷺ tells us, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَمَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ, each of you are responsible for someone, and you are accountable for who you're responsible for. Ideally, a father in a family would do what is beautiful, not simply what is acceptable or what is good, but what is beautiful. Ideally, a mother in a family would do what is beautiful. But where the responsibility becomes very serious is when someone positions themselves as a teacher of Islam or as in any way representative of the divine will. This is a critical point because I've mentioned this before. In my limited experience with Islamic movements as I was growing up in the Middle East, is I found a lot of Islamic movements accepting the logic of siyasa shar'iyya, of political opportunism, rather than the logic of virtuous leadership. That it is not an issue, you're not just another political party. You're not there to just compete and get ahead just like everyone. You're there to set a moral example of virtue, of how godliness can be beautiful. In the same way that I said that a lot of Islamic movements I found surprising that they didn't worship that much. But even more troubling in my view is that they didn't expend a lot of energy into thinking about what would be truly beautiful. Because beauty is often contextual and contingent. Beauty is not simply the perennial principles of beauty, such as justice, balance, proportionality, certain things. But beyond the perennial principles of beauty, it is often context dependent. And if your soul is not itself beautiful, you can't generate beauty. So, if the Prophet ﷺ was not a beautiful human being, can you imagine Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes and says, frowned and turned away when the blind man came to him, and how do you know that he would not be guided? If the Prophet ﷺ was not beautiful, you would say, well, I didn't turn away. I didn't really frown. It wasn't really a frown. I just told him to wait for a second. I just told him I'll get to you soon enough. I just said, I was having an important conversation, for God's sake. Well, I want to set my boundaries, and I want people to know what my boundaries are. Otherwise, they're going to be bouncing all over me. I mean, the endless rationalizations. A beautiful human being responds to beauty. And that's the lesson of Abbas. It's not an easy lesson. It's a very, very, very hard lesson. It's a hard lesson because it says, beautify yourself and rise above egoism. Don't do what is simply correct and good, but do what is truly beautiful.